It is not my intention to undermine anyone's religious beliefs, but simply to investigate a surprisingly deep and bizarre rabbit hole which I stumbled upon some time ago. You're welcome to disagree. My sources, the vast majority of which are drawn from the ancient Hebrew Bible, also known as the Tanakh, are listed in this video's description. Alright, listen closely and try to guess what I'm describing. It has a long snout, and smoke pours from its nostrils. It breathes fire. It has wings and can fly. It dwells inside of a mountain, hoarding its golden treasure. Lastly, it eats livestock, and yes, you heard this right, female virgins too. Well, did you guess Yahweh? If you guessed the God of the Israelites, known by the sacred name Yahweh as described in the Hebrew Bible, you'd be absolutely correct. Yahweh is painted as a vengeful, divine warrior who more often than not violently annihilates his enemies. More than that, the Hebrew Bible uses a set of specific imageries repeatedly to describe his physical presence on earth, ultimately leaving us with an undeniable image of none other than an incredibly powerful dragon. I'm able to present scriptural evidence of each and every feature that I listed before during our guessing game, and more. And it's going to get very weird, especially if you are familiar with an Abrahamic religion, such as Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. We'll begin our journey with the snout or nostrils of Yahweh, a peculiar mystery which led me to stumble upon this rabbit hole in the first place. In the various English versions of the Bible, the Hebrew word apayim is typically translated as a fanciful synonym of face or anger. Modern scholars, however, deem this translation as inaccurate. Why? Because out of the 9 verses that describe Yahweh with this word, all of them specifically reference its elongation and length, which makes absolutely no sense when describing Yahweh's face or anger. Yahweh's apparently long nostrils were so important that they were mentioned so many times throughout multiple generations of scripture. To explain, scholars assume that in ancient Israel, Yahweh may have been seen as a beast with lengthy, protruding nostrils. For example, an alligator, a bull, or, of course, a dragon. This list of potential candidates can quickly be narrowed down, though, by looking at a few key verses. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 22 states the following: "For a fire is kindled in my nostrils, and shall burn to the lowest hell, and it shall consume the earth with her increase, and set ablaze the foundations of the mountains." And then we have the description of Yahweh in Psalms. "Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from out of his mouth. Coals flamed forth from him." Before we proceed to the next argument, on the possibility of Yahweh's physical nature, might this be why he required a massive portable tent known as a tabernacle, as recorded in Exodus? For 440 years, this building-sized tent was the supposed earthly dwelling place of Yahweh, where offerings of prepared meals as well as sacrificed livestock were given on a daily basis, and a thick smoke was known to appear at the door when it was opened. In our investigation of the nostrils, I briefly mentioned Yahweh's massive tent, the tabernacle, where he received prepared food and sacrificed livestock on a daily basis. Of course, this is far from the only instance Yahweh accepted edible offerings. In chapter 31 of the book of Numbers, Yahweh commands the prophet Moses and his army of 12,000 men to take revenge against the Midianites and wage bloody war on their people. For readability's sake, we'll use the New Living Translation, but you'll find that, regardless of your version of the Bible, the explicit details of this passage are exactly the same. After murdering every Midianite man and their leaders, pillaging their city, and capturing all the women and children, Moses commands his troops to kill all the boys and all the women who have had intercourse with a man. It's passages like these that remind you how brutal the older scriptures really were. Moving on though, Moses and his men divide their plunder and give a portion of it to Yahweh, which includes 32 Midianite virgins who were never heard from again. I'm not kidding, you can read the verse yourself. It says, quote, "Half of the plunder was given to the fighting men. It totaled 337,500 sheep and goats, of which 675 were the Lord's share, 36,000 cattle, of which 72 were the Lord's share, 30,500 donkeys, of which 61 were the Lord's share, and 16,000 virgin girls, of whom 32 were the Lord's share." It goes on, though. Moses and Eleazar the priest received the gold from all the military commanders, all kinds of jewelry and crafted objects. In all, the gold that the generals and captains presented as a gift to the Lord weighed about 420 pounds. Okay, there's a lot of details here, so let's talk about the livestock first. The majority of dragons in folklore are carnivores, meaning they eat meat. That one's obvious. But realistically, what could Yahweh possibly want with 32 virgins and 420 pounds of gold? Well, it is an interesting revelation that for many of the cultures that worshipped dragons in the past, the preferred sacrificial offerings were indeed virgin girls. Perhaps you've heard of George and the Dragon. This classical folktale, which is confirmed to predate Christianity, tells of a dragon that demanded a sheep and a maiden, aka a female virgin, sacrifice every day. If you're not familiar with the 10 Commandments, the second and relevant commandment to our next argument is, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," which prohibits the creation and worship of idols. In some interpretations, the chief concern is not necessarily the worship of just any image, but rather whether one is pursuing a false god, as opposed to the true God. This little tidbit may explain why Yahweh actually does permit one idol. This lone idol, known as Nehushtan, depicts none other than a so-called fiery serpent. And more than just permitting the idol, he essentially forces the Israelites to make and worship it by threatening their lives. This odd event occurs in the book of Numbers, chapter 21. During their long journey to the land of Edom, the Israelites struggle with hunger and dehydration in the wilderness and complain to Yahweh. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" Annoyed by their grumbling, Yahweh sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much of the people of Israel died. In the throes of desperation, the survivors begged the prophet Moses to pray to Yahweh and end their torment. Moses obliged. And Yahweh said unto Moses, "Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten shall live when he sees it." And Moses made a serpent of copper, and set it upon the pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he looked unto the serpent of copper, he lived. Later on, in the second book of Kings, this idol is given a name, Nehushtan, which translates to the Great Serpent. The king Hezekiah, before ordering Nehushtan to be destroyed, states that, "For unto those days the children of Israel did offer to it," which, in no uncertain terms, means that the idol was worshipped. Why would Yahweh order the creation of a copper idol, of a fiery serpent, that would certainly be worshipped, especially as it prevented death? As it was the only idol he ever permitted, might we assume that this fiery serpent was a likeness of his own? Coincidentally, multiple studies suggest that long before being worshipped by the Israelites, Yahweh was actually the Canaanite god of metallurgy. And what might be the ancient symbol of Canaanite smelters? A copper serpent mounted on a staff. But returning to that awful punishment in the wilderness, why did Yahweh specifically send fiery serpents? And just what made them so fiery? Note that the term used by Yahweh was actually the Hebrew word seraph, which means to burn. Yet in 5 of the 7 instances where it is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is a noun that inarguably refers to a serpent or snake. This is an example of ancient wordplay, and thus seraph is generally accepted to mean fiery serpent. In English versions of the Bible, 5 of the 7 instances of the word seraph are translated to fiery serpent or something very similar. The 2 exceptions are in Isaiah chapter 6. Both use the plural form seraphim and leave it untranslated. This passage is actually somewhat well known, and perhaps some of you may already be familiar with the image of this angelic creature. Above him stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. Because we can reliably substitute seraphim with fiery serpents, we can go on to make another connection. The verse specifies that they have wings and feet. A fiery flying serpent with wings and feet sounds a lot less like a snake and more like, a dragon. This isn't the only time seraphim are stated to have the ability to fly. 2 distinct times within the book of Isaiah, there is mention of a seraph paired with the Hebrew adjective for flying, typically translating to flying serpent in most English versions of the Bible. Biblical scholars note that there is an essential relationship between Yahweh and the seraphim. The seraphim are considered by all Abrahamic religions to be high-ranking angels, or even the highest of all, as in Christian tradition. Moreover, seraphim are said to fly around the throne of Yahweh in intense worship, and act immediately and aggressively on his command. Flying seraphim in particular are involved in prophecies of his vengeance, and not long after commanding the Israelites never to worship false idols, Yahweh orders his followers to build and worship a likeness of a seraph, which is essentially a holy flying fiery reptile, made of the very copper that Yahweh himself is closely associated with. All this does paint an unexpected picture of Yahweh, the God of Israel, who may or may not be in command of an army of small dragons. Make of that what you will. If we were to go ahead and assume that the God Yahweh was indeed a dragon, we'd have some difficult philosophical questions to answer. Does this invalidate the Abrahamic religions which evolved from the Hebrew scriptures? Have Jews, Christians, and Muslims been worshipping a false god? Something not many people know unless they study the history of Abrahamic religions is that there is actually implication of at least 2 distinct gods in the Hebrew Bible, one being Yahweh and the other being El. It's true that in many cases the names seem to be used interchangeably, but scholars have noted that there may actually be evidence that separates them as deities, specifically in the older scriptures. In all instances, El is the most supreme. He is the God of gods. For sure, the 2 names become completely interchangeable around the era of Moses, where Yahweh introduces himself. I am Yahweh. I revealed myself to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but was not known to them by my name, Yahweh. But before this era, during the time of the prophet Abraham and Proto-Israelite religion, El and Yahweh were almost definitely worshipped as separate deities, with Yahweh being merely one of the gods of El's council. In Deuteronomy, we can actually find a rare example of this, a glimpse into that long-forgotten ancient belief. When the Most High, El, gave to the nations their inheritance. When he separated humanity, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of divine beings. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob and his allotted heritage. Note that this verse can widely vary in its many translations, especially due to its polytheistic implications. For example, the phrase, "the number of divine beings," has been alternatively translated to "the angels of God," "the number in his heavenly court," as well as "the number of El's children." We can put this debate to rest, though, because the Hebrew word in question is Elohim, which is a plural noun signifying multiple gods. In this context, scholars see them as a council of gods, with El being the Most High. At the end of the verse, El divides the world and gives Yahweh the nation of Israel. This little detail changes everything. The God of the Israelites was never the God of all of existence. Yahweh was a lesser deity who served under El. There are other subtle references to the so-called Council of El. Psalm 82 speaks of an assembly of El. Psalm 29 encourages the sons of El to worship Yahweh, which implies that Yahweh's ranking in the council was high. Finally, in Psalm 89, we once again have scriptural evidence and explicit mention that Yahweh is a high ranker of the many sons of El. For who in the heavens can be compared to Yahweh? Who can be likened to Yahweh among the sons of El?
In the world's dawn, God created the heavens and the earth on the second day. And on the very same day, God created the angels, archangels, and cherubim. And these heavenly creatures would inhabit the heavens. The renowned Gabriel and Michael were among these magnificent beings. But there was yet another entity who stood out due to his beauty and splendor, known as Lucifer. He was the most important creature God had ever created. But although he had so many qualities, or perhaps due to that, Lucifer was taken by pride. This is the vice that leads to arrogance, vanity, and endless haughtiness. Pride was one of the 7 deadly sins. The proud Lucifer considered himself to be so perfect that he decided to create his own throne, placed even above God, since he wished to be like God. To accomplish his plan, the evil angel deceived the other angels around him. Therefore, the father of falsehood had by his side a third of the angelic beings who inhabited the heavens. Together, they would unleash a battle for heaven. But Lucifer encountered an outstanding opponent, Archangel Michael, who commanded the heavenly militia of God-loving angels. To defeat the Lord's angels, Lucifer turned himself into a mighty dragon and dueled against Michael, who wielded a flaming sword. Notwithstanding all his might, the dragon did not defeat Michael, since the latter had God by his side. Lucifer and his evil angels were banished from heaven. These angels fell on the earth and were trapped in hell. But Lucifer endured even greater punishment. He, once the most beautiful angel, was transformed into the heinous Satan. Lucifer and his fallen angels started to live in hell. But although defeated, Satan still wanted to avenge himself against his creator and decided to attack his greatest creation, humanity itself, which had been created in the image and likeness of God. A serpent-shaped Satan entered the Garden of Eden and convinced the innocent Eve to taste the forbidden fruit. And using his deceitful tongue, Lucifer concatenated the original sin, which caused Adam and Eve to be driven out of paradise. After that, Satan would devote all his efforts to alienate man from God, turning them into sinners so that they failed to reach paradise. Lucifer, the fallen angel, rejected God's grace, and therefore will spend eternity trying to destroy his work.